Welcome to a short video on how to write an effective introduction for the IGCSE English Language Coursework Analysis. We're going to look at two short introductions to two different questions today, and we're going to look at two different approaches for writing an introduction. So here's the first one. The question was compare and contrast ways in which two writers portray ideas of awakening personal experience. And here is the introductory paragraph. Still I Rise and The Story of an Hour are both texts which have recurring similar themes, as well as having distinct, differentiating components which set them apart. Angelou, author of Still I Rise, focuses her poem indirectly on black and female history, and the obstacles her ancestors have had to face. Chopin, author of The Story of an Hour, on the other hand, discusses the final moments of a young woman's life from a third-person narrative. It's somehow less personal, as it's not written in first person, but still portrays Mrs. Mallard in the face of freedom after years of oppression. So, a fluent introduction. Now, the question we need to ask ourselves is, exactly what does it do? Well, in the very opening sentence here, we have a very basic sentence which links the two. So the first thing that you could do is to have a go at linking the two texts together, as this candidate does here. Then what we get next, I won't highlight it all, but I'll just highlight by the side here. So we get this section, Angelou focuses her poem indirectly on black and female history and the obstacles her ancestors have had to face. Chopin, on the other hand, discusses the final moments of a young woman's life from a third-person narrative. So what we have here is essentially just a basic introduction to the content of the two texts. Because you've got to imagine that the examiner who's finally going to read this might not know these texts particularly well. So what this candidate does here is they give basically a one-sentence summary of what is going on in each text. A couple of words to pick out that might help you here. Focuses here. Focuses her poem indirectly on black and female history. Chopin, on the other hand, a nice link made, discusses the final moments of a young woman's life. So a few key words there, focuses, discusses. On the other hand, you could link your two texts together in exactly that way. She's doing things at quite a high level here, perhaps. Focuses her poem indirectly on black and female history, the obstacles her ancestors have had to face, the final moments of a young woman's life. One interesting thing to try and do would be to tell us a little bit about the narrative of each of the texts. Here we get this idea that Story of an Hour is a third-person narrative, and obviously on the other side of things, Still I Rise is a first-person narrative. So perhaps give us some information on narrative and the perspective that the texts are perhaps written from. With disabled and out, you've got authorial perspectives looking at a particular character, so you could talk about that. And they do get to the core of each idea. Freedom after years of oppression. Obstacles her ancestors have had to face. So there is also a really high-level understanding of the two texts, even in that opening paragraph. Notice what there isn't in this introduction. There aren't any quotations from the texts here, which is absolutely fine, because obviously, as you can see later on in her first main paragraph, she gets straight into the text and analysing and exploring the language and what that means. So you don't need to do that in an introduction. So that's the first one. Let's have a quick look then at the second one. Slightly different style of introduction here, about two different texts. Let's give it a read through first of all. Tony Harrison's The Bright Lights of Sarajevo and Wilfred Owen's Disabled are two poems that present conflict throughout. Wilfred Owen's Disabled is aimed at making people feel emotionally moved. Owen does this especially well as he was a soldier in World War I, like the soldier he writes about, so his writing is infused by the military hospital and soldiers he would have encountered. In Disabled, the soldier doesn't understand conflict as he thinks there will be esprit de corps and drums and cheers. In The Bright Lights of Sarajevo, the conflict is understood because people know about the war but are still continuing to live their lives, like the couple who still try to be flirtatious, as they have been accustomed to the limitations in their lives caused by conflict. Tony Harrison also uses his first-hand experience as he worked as a journalist, writing about Sarajevo in the early 90s, which strongly influences his writing. So, a slightly different kind of introduction here. Let's have a look at what we might be able to pick out of it. Again, just like the other one, the opening sentence mentions both texts, and essentially, in the broadest sense possible, it answers the question as well. This question here for this candidate was about conflict in any two texts from section B of the anthology. Tony Harrison's Bright Lights of Sarajevo, Wilfred Owen's Disabled are two poems that present conflict throughout. Perfect. We then get, just like we had in the other one, an account of the key ideas in one text, then about halfway through this paragraph we see about here that things start to change and we get the key ideas in another text. Okay, so there's, very similar to the other one, a way to do a good introduction. This one does use quotations. Here we are told about the esprit de corps and the drums and cheers from Disabled. We've also got the flirting from The Bright Lights of Sarajevo. So we do have quotations in this one. They're not analysed though, notice that. There is no analysis of these quotations, and that is probably the best thing to do in an introduction because you don't want to preempt what you're going to say later on in the essay itself. There is in here some really nice kind of background information. So here and here about Harrison and about Owen. So in the other one, I mentioned that the other candidate spoke about the narrative perspective, where these tales are written from, if you like. And this candidate does that here as well. She talked about how Owen was a soldier in World War I, so he's very good at displaying these ideas about conflict. Then she mentions how Tony Harrison did some work as a journalist in Sarajevo. So again, we see from his perspective what life is really, really like. Okay, so essentially, that's your key aim with an introduction. It's to provide us with a key account of what you consider to be the most important points about those two texts. You might want to bring in a couple of quotations. You might want to bring in some stuff about the narrative perspective. Are these pieces first person, third person? If they're third person, is the author an expert here? Or is it a kind of first person narrative where the emotions come to the fore much more? Try to make sure that you use your keyword from the question. In this case, it was conflict. Okay, so any questions, do find me on Teams and ask me, or drop me an email. Hopefully that has given you a rough idea of how to write an effective introduction.